Hi, Brittany here.
And I'm Claire, and you're listening to Eco Curious, a podcast dedicated to bringing interesting, relevant, and local science to the masses.
This podcast is created by the Petitcodiac Watershed Alliance, a non-profit environmental organization based in Moncton, New Brunswick. To begin, would you be able to define an Acadian forest for us?
Sure. So the Acadian forest is the forest that's found in New Brunswick as well as Nova Scotia and surrounding areas. It's that mixed wood forest. So we have the leafy deciduous trees and the evergreen trees. So it's really a mixture of the trees that we would associate with the boreal forest, some of the leafy trees of the Appalachian forest. So we're really lucky because we have forests with 32 native tree species, and it's called the Acadian forest. Well, many people don't know why it's called that, and it's called that because of a government scientist called it that, I believe a few decades ago, and sometimes today it's referred to as the Atlantic forest or the mixed wood forest. So there are different labels for it too.
I didn't know
that either. And in your opinion, what is the importance of the Acadian forest to the environment in New Brunswick?
Yeah, so having a healthy forest is so important, whether it's for the wildlife that live there, that we all appreciate, and for people too. Many people across this province make a living from the forest, whether it's maple syrup, fiddlehead, mushrooms, as well as timber harvesting too. And we have a long history of that. And so having a healthy forest is important for other reasons too. Say, for example, in the fight against climate change, having old forests is important that way. Yes, it's important for various reasons.
So the Acadian forest is one of the 6 endangered forests in Canada. Why is it at risk?
So the World Wildlife Fund a few years ago put out a report, and that's where that comes from, where they did some analysis that revealed that the Acadian forest is one of these 6 endangered forest types. We are converting our natural forests to softwood plantations. I think that's something that's quite obvious to people as they drive down New Brunswick Highway.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they'll see a plantation that's not a forest, if you're familiar with what our natural forest should look like. And over the years we've been increasingly converting that natural forest to these softwood plantations of 1, 2, 3, or 4 softwood species, fir or spruce or jack pine, say, for example. But while we're clear cutting and spraying to get rid of the beautiful hardwood trees that we have, like maples and birches and ash trees. So that's really I think the primary reason why our forest is endangered is due to our mismanagement of the forest.
So what can we do to help properly manage the Acadian forest here in North America? And also, what is the Conservation Council of New Brunswick currently doing?
There are a number of things that I think need to change. So that if we start here in New Brunswick, the Conservation Council and other groups like the New Brunswick Federation of Woodlot Owners, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and many other groups, nature groups, for example, want to see that the Crown Lands and Forests Act, which is the legislation that oversees the management of our forests. And we feel that piece of legislation has long been a problem, that it's outdated. It came into being in 1982 and it hasn't been modernized since then, when other provinces that have a forestry industry, say, for example, Nova Scotia, Ontario, British Columbia, have all modernized their forest legislation in ways that are more ecologically responsible, more socially acceptable. Just the way that we're managing our forests today, I think most people would agree if you talk to them on the street or at the markets, which we often do, to get people's opinions and to get their support for, say, petitions against spraying the forest. There seems to be a consensus there that our forests are being mismanaged and that we need to change course. And so the key thing, or the stumbling block, or what's hindering our move towards there is this piece piece of legislation that's outdated. So we need to tackle that. We also need to tackle the forestry strategies that came into place in 2014 that further set us back. We need to be moving away from, say, for example, spraying the forest with glyphosate-based herbicides. So those are some of the things.
Mm-hmm. What was the turning point in 2014?
Yeah, so in 2014, the Allward government at the time signed these forestry contracts with three of the largest forestry companies in the province, one of them being J.D. Irving. And those forestry contracts, for the first time ever, we've never done this before, so those forestry contracts guaranteed those companies a guaranteed access to wood supply from our public land, from our crown land. It's also called the crown land, the public land, and also an increase in the wood that's normally allocated every year to those forestry companies. So for a long time, groups like the Conservation Council were made aware that the forestry industry was wanting more wood and a guaranteed supply of that wood from our public land, and we tried to stop it. But in 2014, the forestry industry, primarily J.D. Irving, got its wish and got that increased wood supply, which meant more clear cutting and more spraying of the forest. At a time when New Brunswickers have never been more mobilized against spraying the forest, there's an active organization called Stop Spraying MB that has thousands of Facebook
members. Oh yes,
members.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, and also a petition. We think it's a historic petition that never before has so many signatures to a petition been tabled in the legislature, and so that petition was against spraying the forest. There are over 30,000 signatures to a hard copy petition, so people across the province, I know in northern New Brunswick and Rogersville and southern part of the province, people went door to door, got signatures to that petition. So I think it's quite clear that, the people don't want their forests to be sprayed, to be treated like, a conventional garden where we spray to get rid of, say, for example, weeds, but we shouldn't treat our forests like that. It's an ecosystem that's so diverse that can support such a wide variety of life and industries. So if we're just degrading the land by spraying, and we're hoping that, that pressure, we need to, I think, build on the work that's been done so far by people across this province to finally get the change we want.
Yeah.
As you said earlier, there was an increase in these companies like J.D. Irving for more clear cutting. So why do you think the demand for wood went up?
I think the problem here is the fact that we're treating our resource in a way that benefits a private player, and that it shouldn't be treated that way. Like our forest is supposed to be a public resource that's managed for the benefit of all New Brunswickers, and that's what the government should be doing, as opposed to letting an industry have full say of what goes on in our forests in order for them to make a profit. And it shouldn't be about demand and profits, and it should be about managing our forests so that it sustains various kinds of livelihoods, that it's able to benefit all New Brunswickers, whether that's through providing monies for healthcare, for example. What we do know is the way that we manage our forests today, that it's actually costing more than what the money that we're actually bringing in. So if we look at the annual reports of the Department of what is now Energy and Resource Development, it used to be Department of Natural Resources. If we look at those annual reports, we see that we're spending more money when it comes to the forestry industry in our province than we are actually getting back in the way of royalties or whatever, which is completely wrong, and that we should be benefiting from the use of those resources.
Do you think that result of the revenue being less than we want will actually have a good impact on the environmental organizations, and hopefully policies will change in favor for us? Because of that?
I hope so. I think that's an argument that I know that environmental groups have been using, and whether it's, say, for example, for advocating for what's called community forestry, so where the community manages its local forest for the benefit of all in the community. There's stewardship values and where the benefits that come from the use of those resources benefit more people, and there's democratic decision making at the local level. And that's not to say that the province wouldn't have a role to play, like maybe they would be regulating, say for example, environmental protections, but community forestry is where I see environmental and social values, also economic values, all coming together in a way that benefits the community, and that is also ecologically responsible, because people want the forest in their backyard to be protected. We found this out when we were doing work with people in Upper Miramichi in the Boys Town area, where they talked about the importance of the Miramichi River and their forests, and they wanted to see a community forest model as opposed to the current industrial forest model that's clear-cutting the forest in their backyard.
I'm glad to hear it. And it still instills hope that the conversation seems to be changing, at least within communities in New Brunswick, where it's seeing forests less as a commodity and more for the community. Just to veer away, what, in your opinion, would be the proper way to manage the forest? What is the proper management that we could do from this point on?
First, I think we need to honor the peace and friendship treaties. So we need to recognize that we are on unceded Indigenous land, that land was never surrendered, and that we are all treaty people. That say for example, my ancestors signed, the Crown signed these treaties with the Indigenous peoples here. But since those treaties were signed, they've been violated, and one way that they're violated is through the way that our forests are managed that doesn't involve Indigenous people, that respects their views about how to protect the land for 7 generations, for example. I think that's the first thing that we need to do is to have those conversations with Indigenous communities. I think community forestry is a hopeful way to manage our forests. There are a number of examples in places like British Columbia where First Nations and community groups have come together to manage a forest, whether it's for timber extraction or say for example ecotourism. So there's many different ways that we can make a living from our forest that also ensures a healthy forest. And I think we have so much work to do here in New Brunswick to restore our forest. And it's not all bad news. Our forest is very resilient. It will come back if it's allowed to come back. But if we clear cut and then spray it and grow a plantation, we're destroying that possibility. So, and there are a number of groups that are across this province, like Community Forest International. The woodlot owners are also doing some important work on looking at the future and a future of climate change, and looking at how we should be managing our forests. If we know the kind of climate that we're going to have into the future, it will be a different forest. Some of the trees that currently thrive here will not do so well in the future. So we also need to be thinking about all of these things, and not just thinking about what's good for the industry in terms of their profit motives.
So we're going to move on to the topic of biomass mining. Can you first define what biomass mining is for our listeners?
Yeah, so it's harvest wood for bioenergy. So, and I have to admit that this is an area that I haven't worked on so much in the recently. But there are ways to do it that would be more ecologically responsible. I guess the concern with biomass harvesting is that we would be taking too much from our forest. What's left behind after a cut is, still important for enriching the soil, for example, and so it's important that, just like any other kind of harvesting or extraction from the natural environment, that we consider what we're taking and whether that's compromising the ecosystem.
Are there any impacts on the Acadian forest, for example?
Yes, definitely. If it's not done right, if we take too much for biomass, we could be compromising the soil. Dead wood degrades. It enriches soil with nutrients. It also provides habitat for a variety of wildlife, and it's a place where animals seek shelter and find food. So it's something that I think it could be part of our future energy strategy, but we need to think about how it's done and done in a responsible way.
So we hear you are currently working on the second edition of the book, Great Trees of New Brunswick. What can we expect from this newer edition?
The book going to include all of the 32 native tree species. So the first edition that was published 30 years ago and written by David Bolster was a great book where it compiled the stories of people's great trees. This new edition that will be out next year includes all the 32 native tree species, as well as a few exotic species that are common or well known to people. Some of the ornamental trees that we may see in our cities, so that people are able to identify them and get to know their trees. We're hoping that it makes people, more aware of their trees. And for me, it was important to do this project because I thought it would further make people fall in love with the forest in an effort to protect it.
I'm really, really excited about this. But what makes a tree great for this book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what we did was there's actually some great tree criteria out there that's used by groups in the United States and also some different provinces where they look at things like the height of the tree, the diameter, the crown spread. So we use that in our point system, as well as the beauty, the uniqueness of the tree, and also the story that went along with the tree. So we thought the story was in some ways just as important as things like the height of the tree or the age of the tree. So the trees that have made it into the book are usually the oldest specimens that we did find for the tree in New Brunswick, and we're hoping that this leads to people going out there and they may even find an older tree or a more taller tree in the future, and that will hopefully add to a project where we maybe catalog our great trees and that people can also go look at them too. So it will include the locations for a number of these trees, and so people can go and visit them.
Now, for someone who doesn't have an ecology background, do you have any tips for how someone could go and find a great tree and submit it to this book? Like, how would they determine how old the tree is, or whether the diameter is large enough or great enough?
That would be a big question for my co-author, the forester, who was one of the people who he went out and measured all the trees. And we actually our submissions are now closed, but we've actually submitted the manuscript to the publisher.
How many submissions did you guys get?
We got 164 submissions.
Wow, that's not bad.
Yeah.
Not bad at all.
So that was great, and I think, and we're still receiving, some submissions and stories from people. It was a really great project, one where I, was excited to open my inbox every day to see what people were telling me about their great tree, and got a number of trees that maybe wouldn't be nowhere near what would be considered a great tree if we were just to look at, say, height or diameter, but the story that went along with the tree was just as important. So really, I think we didn't put that information out there on purpose because, say, like giving suggestions of height or diameter for each tree species, because we wanted to leave it, more open for people to submit their great tree.
Aw, I think that's really sweet. A very comprehensive criteria. Emotional value also makes a great tree great. And you said the second edition that's coming out is going to include all of the native species in New Brunswick, all 34. Why were there native species left out of the last one, if you know?
I think David's unfortunately no longer with us, so he can't answer that question for us. But I think maybe he just left it open, and a lot of the trees that are in the first edition, for example, white pine, white elm, sugar maple, those are the trees that I think that we encounter more often in our daily lives, and so those trees probably had a number of submissions from people. So I think that might be one of the reasons. And we had a really hard time with some of the species. Like we had to put a specific call out for the second edition. Like for example, jack pine, cedar. Trying to think what other maybe some of the hardwoods too, butternut. We had a hard time getting great tree nominations for them, but we eventually did, so I think it was definitely worth it to include all the different tree species, and some of the trees, especially the ones within the same families or that are hard to distinguish. We could include a section in the book for each tree that talks about their defining features. So, and it's written in a way, it's not so much a field guide, sort of a field guide, folksy sort of book where people that it's accessible, that, that you'll be able to read it and then tell your friend about what's special about a basswood tree.
Awesome. So when this book is published, will it be available in a paperless edition, like an ebook?
Yeah, we hope so. It's something that we're discussing with our editor, our publisher, Goose Lane. So Goose Lane does publish ebooks, so I'm hoping so.
Awesome.
So we're also interested in another project that you're working with, Raven, which is...
It stands for Rural Action and Voices for the Environment.
Would you be able to tell us the objective of this project and your involvement with it?
Sure. So this is a new project that involves the establishment of a research hub at the University of New Brunswick that's focused on alternative digital media for rural social justice. So the project comes out of a project that's currently funded, that just recently got funded to make media for rural social justice. So we're hoping to build on the project that we're currently doing to establish a research hub called Raven at the University of New Brunswick, in a partnership with researchers that work on rural issues, as well as the media at different universities in the province, as well as organizations that are champions for rural social justice, so including farmers, woodlot owners, Indigenous land defenders. We'll also be studying the use of that media too.
What are the benefits of including citizens in environmental decision-making? Like you said, farmers and landowners.
Yeah, I think it's crucial in a democratic society that we should be consulting, and not just consulting, but also getting the consent of local people who are affected by the decisions that are made about their local environment. And I know in terms of forestry, people have been very upset in the last few years because they felt that their voices have been increasingly marginalized and silenced in decision making when it comes to the forest. Years ago, there used to be different ways that people had a say. Sometimes there was public town hall meetings, or there were these roundtables that included environmental groups. So I remember when I joined the Conservation Council 12 years ago, our executive director at the time, David Kuhn, sat on this ministerial roundtable on the forest with other environmental groups. So it was a way where they would regularly meet with the minister and talk about forest policy. Unfortunately, those type of meetings and ways for the community to have a say no longer exist. So I think that's something that we have to demand again, is that there be ways for people to have a genuine say in decisions that affect our environment.
Yeah, certainly. It's such a simple concept to let everyone have their say. It seems like a really incredible project. With so many different researchers, as it is such a multidisciplinary project, are there any difficulties in having so many specialists and farmers, Indigenous land protectors involved with this?
I think involving everybody from the beginning is really important. If we look at, and this is maybe an urban issue, but the fight right now to save trees in Officer Square in Fredericton, and I know there's a similar battle, I think, happening in the Moncton area too. When we don't involve people from the beginning on decisions, it can cause even more problems in the end. And I think, we could have had a better plan to protect our trees from the very beginning if people were consulted in the beginning. And there are definitely going to be challenges of working with different groups that have different interests. For our project, it's important that the profit motive not be the deciding factor, I guess, and that goes back to the media and how we see the media being a problem when profit motive is the concern. I'm with the MB Media Co-op, which is a partner with this Raven project, and so we formed almost 10 years ago because our different social justice groups, whether it was labor, students, environmentalists, we all thought that the media in this province was a problem, and that is that there's the Irving family owns most of the media, and that at the time there wasn't many independent media projects out there. So I think it's important to have media that gives voice to people who are often marginalized.
Of course.
I love that the Raven Project is funded with so much consideration and support for the role of rural individuals and communities. Are there any sustainable initiatives in New Brunswick that are on your radar that you may be excited to cover within the Raven Project?
Yeah, so there are not many, and I'm currently meeting with many different groups across the province who are all very interested in being part of the Raven project. But I think that really speaks to the need for media that gives a voice to people who are working on having thriving rural communities. We're hoping to work with the Wolfsquay grandmothers who are defending their land from a proposed mine site outside of Fredericton. Also, woodlot owners who are struggling to compete with the big players in our forestry industry. We are also talking to farmer organizations. We want to bear focus on regenerative farming practices. There are many good stories out there. That's something that I think this project will focus on. Oftentimes, when the media reports on a story from a rural community, it's one of tragedy, or there's fire, or another, a mill has shut down, where people have lost their jobs. It's oftentimes bad news, but there's also a lot of good things that are happening in our community that I think can also be inspiring for other communities in the province. The number of young farmers in New Brunswick that are using regenerative farming practices, going organic, and they provide inspiration for others as well.
If this project goes well within its first couple of years, can you guys see it spreading across the province and involving all of our rural communities?
Yes, I think it can involve folks in our rural communities who want to be storytellers. So we have our projects, and I didn't get into this yet, but we'll be doing different things like what's called photo voice or self-filming. So photo voice involves working with groups of people who tell their stories through photographs. And then usually there's a photo exhibition at the end where people can take in people's photo stories. Self-filming involves filming with cell phones, where again a group of people tackling an issue or a research question. It could be something like, how can we better support New Brunswick farmers, for example, and then they can produce this media that speaks to that it's from directly their words or their visuals, and then we hope that we can spread that too, so that we would be providing different kinds of platforms, whether it's through the Raven website or the Media Co-op website, or getting their work into film festivals, their photo exhibits into community halls. So yeah, we're really excited about what this project can do.
Wow, that's amazing.
Really fantastic. How do we follow the progress of this project?
Well, we haven't even launched the project yet. We're hoping to do that in September. Okay. We do have a website that will be also launched September. So if you looked up Raven Research Hub, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And we'll also have social media, so there'll be a Facebook page, and hopefully, using other forms of social media too, like Twitter and Instagram, to get out all this great media that I'm sure the storytellers in our rural communities will share with us.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it. Looking forward to it, for sure.
So that is actually the end of all of our questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. You were very informative. Yes. I certainly learned a lot.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a good day. Okay, bye-bye.